really happy to be here. A few things that I just wanted to say at the beginning is that I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation that I put together that's going to go over the theories that we're talking about, and also then take a break to answer some questions, and then go back into the presentation and talk a little bit about treatment considerations. And so that's going to be the approach today. And so I'm gonna jump to sharing a screen here so that I can talk with you. Hold on one sec. And here we go. Okay, first and foremost, I want to say how happy I am to be in this conference. I've presented for SASH conferences probably around another four times in the past. And I'm so committed to SASH particularly because of what their focus is, what their mission is. The Society for the Advancement of Sexual Health, and being a not-for-profit that's been so significant for me to stay involved with SASH. And I've been involved with SASH way back when they were under another name, probably, I think I joined in the late 90s. I've stayed very, very committed to this organization because of the mission. And it's been such a great support, the listserv and whatnot. So I'm very pleased to be here. I also love the topic of nobody ever told me that, sexual health for grown-ups, and then join the conversation. So that to me feels really exciting. And my presentation, I'll get into a little bit of the focus, but it's really going to be about growing up and what that means, and what that means for the men that we work with. So I also want to say that in New York, that's where I'm presenting from. I welcome people to share where they have come from in their comments if they'd like to. I also welcome people to have comments with one another about any of the material that's being presented. And then when the slide comes up with the question mark, we'll know that we're ready to answer some questions, and I will do the same thing at the very end of the presentation. So let's start. Excuse me. So I'm presenting from the SAP project, and the SAP project is a program that I founded a number of years ago with a real focus on using attachment theory and affect theory as a treatment for out-of-control sexual behavior. The SAP project approach is, again, looking at out-of-control sexual behavior as an attachment and affect regulation disorder. And a huge part of what we do is we're exploring attachment narratives, and I'll explain more of what that means. We're examining the ability to regulate affects, because it's my strong belief if we don't help people with regulation, that they're going to always stay vulnerable to out-of-control sexual behaviors, as well as other types of out-of-control behaviors. So we're really looking at increasing self-regulation and co-regulation, so using others to regulate ourselves rather than using activities and behaviors and whatever workaholism, out-of-control sexual behavior, compulsive shopping, you name it. Those are all auto-regulatory behaviors. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about why they're auto-regulatory. Because it has a lot to do with not having consciousness around it. So that's the SAT project approach. The presentation I'm doing today is on gender development. This is a real mouthful of a title. Gender development and superego pathology as it relates to out-of-control sexual behavior. And that's my first part of the title. And the second part is from victimhood to emotional literacy and agency. And basically, I'll make it clear what we're going to try and address with that. But you can see that in the title, I'm addressing a number of issues in a very synthesized way of how gender development relates to the part of our psyche, the superego, that can be so harsh and so vicious and very much a shame-producing part of the psyche. And I'm going to talk about how does that relate to out-of-control sexual behavior. And the other thing that I'm going to talk about is how do we take our patients, our clients, from victimhood to emotional literacy, and then what we call agency. Agency, taking responsibility. You know, taking a stand in their life, stand in their relationships, stand with their families. And so that is really the focus, and that's been a big focus of the work that I've been doing over the last number of years. Today's objectives are, just to be clear, number one is, the objective number one is participants will be able to discuss the connection between emotional literacy and out of control sexual behavior. That's going to be very, very clear by the end of this presentation about how serious emotional literacy is for the sake of our patients' recovery and their continued recovery. I'm also going to ensure that participants will be able to describe the various defenses against guilt, grief, and regret. And so one of the things that I'm going to be highlighting is the idea that if we don't help our patients to enter into a place of true guilt, true grief, and true regret, then we're really not getting them into that longer term recovery process. And I'll explain that patients can present as guilty and grieving and regretful, and it may not be anchored in a true self, but actually anchored in a false self. And I'll give examples of that in my practice, where I could see some of the men presenting, or as we call in program, acting as if that they were experiencing grief or regret or guilt, but it wasn't real. And it's important to know the difference. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then, hold on a sec. Participants will also be able to utilize skills to enhance clients' emotional literacy and then help them embrace the true guilt, grief, and regret, which brings them to a longer term recovery. So those are our objectives today. And let's begin. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about is gender and masculinity in American culture. And in a sense, the social construction of gender is a little bit of the culprit in this. Not the whole culprit, but it's a variable in terms of some of the difficulties that men have had around their sexual behavior and their sense of entitlement, the experience of being emotionally shut down, the experience of not being able to identify what they feel. I'm going to talk a good bit about deactivation. So like we sometimes see in the couples that we work with, that one spouse will be hyperactivated and very, very charged and upset and distressed. And what we see sometimes with the men that we work with is that, and it could be with women too, but with men in particular, that there's a deactivation. And I'm going to explain the deactivation from a little bit more of a societal, ecological, cultural point of view, so that we can expand the lens in which to understand out of control behaviors. So it takes it, it's really pulling the camera back and getting a much wider lens of the things that we struggle with, that we become part of because of social construction. So here's some examples of the social construction of masculinity. Started way back when, right? And it continues. We see John Wayne, Clark Gable. These are all examples. You know, now we have John Hamm, that for people that watched Mad Men, there's talk about a social construction of masculinity and entitlement and exploitation and all of the things that came along with that. The series was quite the statement about, and very much about autoregulation, turning to a drink, turning to sex, turning to power as a way to compensate for trauma that happened in the past that wasn't even that conscious. So we see all different types of examples of the social construction of masculinity. Thor, there's many examples in our current media. What's interesting about that, and this is going to be the piece on really understanding what our responsibility is in helping our boys grow up, which again, this is why I loved the title of the conference, is like, this is what the work is. The work is helping our boys that have become men to understand what it is that's happened to them, and then hopefully to prevent it with their sons and their daughters and their families. And so that is a big part of what we're going to be talking about. Let me start with Lavon's theory on men and their emotions. His theory was very interesting because what he pointed out was that gender studies indicated that infant boys display a high level of emotionality. In many of his studies, and there's been other studies to back this up, Lavon felt that boys actually were more emotional than little girls, and that there was more distress and just emotionality and anger, and all of that was there during infancy. And here's the interesting part, is that Lavon points out a complete reversal by the age of 4. That changes, it reverses. The emotional boy becomes the deactivated boy. The emotional boy becomes the shutdown boy. The emotional boy becomes the muted boy. And as we think about that and really hold that in our mind as we proceed with the rest of the presentation, you'll see how important that is to understand, because we're not dealing with boys that have become men that are now sociopathic or without some sense of emotionality, even though they have to figure out how to identify it, which I'll talk about when we get into some of the treatment aspects. The other thing that I wanted to share is that in the book by Gilligan and Snyder about patriarchy, they noted that this happens again at the age of 13 and 14. That there's again another shutdown. There's another socialization out of their feelings. And then I'm going to add some newer research that indicates that there's another degree of disconnection from one's feeling states and from one's relationality that happens from 16 to 19. So I'll talk about that, but we're talking about layers of socialization processes and social construction processes that have resulted in men being deactivated, shut down, and then at risk for out of control sexual behaviors, at risk for at higher risk for suicidality, higher risk for homicide, higher risk for drug abuse. It really gives us a much more ecological view of why our men are at such high risk. So let's talk about boys to men. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a social outline about this, is that Lavon's theory was really focused on the idea that this socialization process from boys to men is something that is supported by parents, peers, and society. I think it's changing, but I don't think it's changing drastically. I think it's a very gradual change. I think in some ways, in our movement towards understanding gender as a social construction, there's been more openness to understanding this. But I do think it's a slow going process. The other thing that's so fascinating is Pollock's videos, and Pollock wrote the book Real Boys, and Pollock's videos indicated this socialization process. One of the really fascinating things that he videotaped was that he would videotape parents with their little girls and parents with their little boys. And so when the little girl was distressed or sad or angry, parents had a tendency, and this is all on video, I think he presented it at 60 Minutes, a few conferences and things like that. But what he would do is he would videotape the parents' process with their children. And what he recognized was that in talking with their little girls, parents had a tendency to do more mirroring. They seemed to be more attuned. They seemed to want to get to the root of the feeling state. And like I said, they would mirror it back. They would talk about it in a dialogue. It would be more relational. And then when the parents were talking, this is true also of peers and teachers and things like that, when they were talking to the little boys, what they did that was different than what they did with their little girls is they distracted the little boys. They gave them a toy. They said, go watch TV. They said, in some cases, in a more shaming sense, big boys don't cry, pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of conversations. And basically there was the beginning of a deactivation process for the boys that eventually become the men that we work with. So I think it's really interesting to have Lavon's theory and then have that backed up by Pollack's work in his videotaping of parents and how they talk to their little boys and little girls. And then there's been other research on that since, which I'll talk about as we proceed.
Michael?
Yes.
The question, where was the Lavon research conducted?
I don't know off the top of my head, but one of the things that I would like to do, and I meant to ask you about this, Ron, is I'd like to send a reference sheet that has all the research so that people could see where Pollack's research was, where Lavon's, and also see where the papers are that were published around this. And so I'd be happy to do that.
That would be great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I usually do that in my presentations where I have a bibliography. And so this whole virtual world, precluded that, but I don't think it has to. I think what I'd like to do is send that out to someone at SASH and see if that can get sent out to the participants. Does that sound good?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So let's talk about deactivation. Now, if any of you are not familiar with the still face studies, I recommend that you just get on YouTube and do a search for still face studies, or you could do a search for Tronick, Tronick. The still face studies are just really fascinating, and it's just something I want for us to have in the background. Because basically what the still face studies were about was Tronick wanted to see what do children do when their parents stop mirroring them. So he would have a mother with a child, and it's very hard to watch, but I think they're really important studies. Have a mother with a child that, and they're cooing, and there's all this mirroring and attunement. It's quite lovely. You're watching this lovely experience of attunement. And then what Tronick would say, and other researchers, is still your face. So Tronick would have the mother just remain still. Do not mirror the child. Do not coo with the child. Do not show any emotionality on your face. That would be a reflection of the child's emotionality. And what did we see? We would see that children would go into a place of protest. That they would be like, wait, what's going on here? Why are you just staring at me? So these children would start every strategy that they could come up with to try to get the mother to response. They'd point at things. They would laugh. They would clap their hands. And so what we found is that they would only do that for a certain amount of time, because basically what they went from was protest to despair. To despair. And in the despair, some of the distress got heightened, but you could see that there was this movement that was going from despair to resignation, to being resigned. That it's almost like learned helplessness. If you think about it that way, the studies on learned helplessness is that like the child could not get the response from the parent. And then you would see even the resignation would be physiological. You would see them kind of just fall into themselves. And so we would see that this is the moment of it's what Dan Hill would call deactivation. The child who's now deactivated. If the child gets still faced experiences over and over again in their lives, they become deactivated. That does not mean they don't have feelings. It just means that there's no reason for them to share them, and that they become very much socialized to not even know what they are. And that's a very, very important piece to the work that we're doing and the treatment approach. The other thing that's an interesting piece to this is that, again, from a social construction perspective, is that a lot of the writings about what happens to boys as they become preteens and teenagers is that because of what Fleck calls the gender role strain, they're in a bit of a bind. Because the bind is, if I stay connected to my mother and my father, will I be seen as, well, particularly around the mother, a mommy's boy, mama's boy? Will I be seen in a way from other students, other people in society that I'm not strong? I don't have the power. I don't have the independence, really, in order to be able to look like and behave like other boys. And so this becomes a bind, and Fleck called it a strain. And so one of the things that boys will do, preteen and teenager, is they will pull away, and parents will sometimes support it. You sometimes have a father that says, you baby him too much. You need to push him out. You need to let him go. And so so a number of writers have talked about the idea that there's an emphatic separation that happens, especially in American culture, with our boys, that what I'm saying, it feeds into an intensity of affect that's not necessarily recognized, intensity of affect that's not necessarily utilized in a constructive way. And a huge part of what I'm presenting about, especially in the treatment part, is how do we reconfigure that? How do we change that? So I want people to keep in mind this background of social issues that relate to the idea of being deactivated, pushed out of the family union in a sense, and that there are prices to be paid for that. Because I think back to the title of the SASH presentation is like, nobody, how's it go? Nobody ever told me that sexual health for grown-ups. I think it's like nobody ever helped me to stay connected, relational, and for that reason, I've been put at risk. It's a little bit of I have a very strong statement about this because of seeing so many men suffer, seeing my own father suffer, seeing myself suffer, seeing my brothers suffer, seeing my friends suffer, and then seeing all of their mothers suffer and their sisters suffer. It's like it's a social problem. It's a social problem. So let's talk about male friendships. So in the book Deep Secrets by Niobe Way, which is a follow-up really to Real Boys by Pollack, what Niobe Way is saying is that in her research and in her work, she's seeing that boys, usually by the age of 16, 17, and 18, so they're not only emphatically separated from their mothers in the earlier years, they start to get separated from their friendships. That's what they're referring to when they say deep secrets. Is it the ability to share with friends, the ability to have that really close best friend starts to get interfered with, that you actually start to see that their openness changes. They become more secretive. They feel like they can't express their vulnerability in the same way. All of this socialization has resulted in that. And so male friendships result in lonely boys. When there's the emphatic separation from those friendships that was so meaningful, if you go back to what this looks like and the joy in their faces and the real connection, it looks so genuine. And then you recognize that as they're getting older, their ability to maintain that starts to get interfered with. And then we're left with lonely boys, but it doesn't stop there. And this is where it gets interesting in terms of the superego impact, is that what happens with lonely boys, and this is talked about a great deal in Deep Secrets, is that they become angry boys. So that's really important. It's very, very important to understand is that angry boys are operating with an intensity of affect, specifically anger, and in doing so, they're disconnecting from a lot of other feeling states. And they're obviously, if they're staying in the affect script, is what I call it, of anger and rage, then they're at risk. They're at risk of medical problems. They're at risk of substance abuse, suicidality, homicidality, and so on. So our lonely boys become angry boys. And if we look at anger, I thought this was a great, really great diagram of the fact that an iceberg, they're using an iceberg as the metaphor and recognizing that the iceberg, you only see the tip of the iceberg, right? And so we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is anger. And unfortunately, because of all this socialization process and all of what Lavon has said and Pollack has said and Pleck has said and Way has said, is that there's all of these other feeling states that are below the tip of the iceberg. That's about being fearful, scared, embarrassed, overwhelmed, grieving, stressed, rejected, nervous, exhausted, annoyed, all of these feeling states that are underneath there that so many boys to men don't recognize. They only know the tip of the iceberg. And so many of us in our interactions with these boys to men, we only know the tip of the iceberg. So from a treatment perspective is like, you got to get under the tip of the iceberg. You got to get you have to get to these other emotions. And that's going to take some time, and it requires a process. So one of the things I want to say is that this goes to superego pathology, you know, and this gets into psychoanalytic thinking. You know, they used to say that boys that develop a really harsh superego, the part of our psyche that judges and that controls and that has moralism and so on, that is based on the identification with a father that might have been that way or a mother that might have been that way. Well, that the psychoanalytic thinking and the object relational thinking has not seen it that way. They've seen it being more about the anger that the child has towards the rejecting parents, towards the rejecting society, towards societies that enable and are complicit, and them not being able to identify their more vulnerable emotions. So what I have found that's been the most interesting part of the work for me is that if I understand that my patients are coming in with this severity, this harshness, it helps me to understand why they keep doing things that cause them more trouble. That's why I share this slogan, so to speak: we are not punished for our sins, but we are punished by our sins. Like, shame begets shame. How many times have people here had a patient that had a shameful experience? I can just give you like one simple example of getting a performance evaluation at work. Doesn't go well. They don't get their bonus or whatever it is that they might have gotten, or a raise, or a promotion. And that stirs up the shame in them. Self-loathing, I'm no good. And it's also fueled by anger, by the way. And then next thing you know, they go and they really do something to hang their hat on. Shame begets shame. If we don't try to help people to stop that chain and understand better about what's going on for them, then they're just they're gonna roll out into all these behaviors. I have other examples where patients have engaged in out of control sexual behavior, and then when they're done with that, then they run to a Burger King or McDonald's and they gorge on fast food. Shame begets shame. Then they go home and they isolate. Shame begets shame. So I think we really have to understand that a lot of our men are coming in with these severe superegos, and back in the day they used to call it Superego Lacunae. Superego Lacunae meant that the superego had holes in it. So you would see male patients that had severe, harsh superegos, and then all of a sudden, no morality, no control. So the experience early in recovery, early in their process or pre-recovery, is that even if they feel guilt, it is not going to direct their behavior because their superego hasn't been patched up yet. So that is the metaphor that I use when I'm thinking about my patients, is like, how can I understand where the holes are in their superego and what makes them do these entitled things and harmful things, which I think is so related to lonely boys turning into angry boys turning into angry men turning into entitled men. And again, the holes in the superego that have to be patched up. That's the intensity of the work that we're doing and the treatment that we're providing. So I just want to say, I want to say this, and it may sound dramatic, but I don't think it's dramatic. We are in a crisis of connection, and maybe even more so now. You know, there's probably effects of the pandemic, but there's all the decades of socialization. And so we are in a crisis of connection, and no piece of art tells the story better than this. So this is from, I forget what it's from now. Burning Man. I blanked out. I've never been there, but this was a couple of years ago, and it was one of the pieces of art that came out of Burning Man. And what was really beautiful about it, poignant and saddening in many ways, is if you look at the piece of art, is you see two adults that are facing away from each other. They're back to back, but they will not look at each other. And they look deflated. They look deactivated. But if you look inside them, you see we could say inner child, we could say younger self state that is actually desiring contact. And I actually, for those of you that are doing couples work, I recommend that you look online, you find one of these, you find this picture, this piece of art, and you put it in a frame and you put it in your offices. So that's what I did, because without a doubt, my couples always notice it. And they're like, what is that? And then I tell the story. And I tell the story of like what this means. And then I tell the story of how this affects the work we're going to do. That this is the essence of the work we're going to do, is try to understand this more vulnerable self state that exists within these deactivated couples, or hyperactivated and deactivated couples, depending on what we're seeing. So we are in a crisis of connection. And let me tell you a little bit about some of the science and research that went behind some of my thinking. The SAP project research that we did a focus group, and I guess that was around 8-10 years ago. And then I did some quantitative research, which was around maybe 6-7 years ago. Basically, what I was in the focus group, I brought a group of therapists that had all different viewpoints. So I had a somatic experiencing therapist, I had a CBT therapist, I had a behavioral analysis therapist, I had a psychoanalyst, I had different types of psychoanalytic thinking, object relations, classic psychoanalytic, and I presented a case. That was a real case. I changed the identifying information, but it was a case that was hugely challenging for me. And in many ways was a failed case, because what I wanted to get from the group was to find out what did they think were the primary areas that needed to be addressed, and how do they think that they needed to be addressed. And what was so interesting is, for those of you that are familiar with the procedures of focus groups, is that you kind of start looking at themes and you code all of the narrative. I had to record everything and have it written out. And the major theme was affect. This patient is trying to manage their affect. They've never learned how to do it, and they're doing it this way. And the patient has intense affect of rage and anger. So said in the way that I understand it is that my patient had an affect script of anger and rage. And that was his primary affect script. And he engaged with it over and over again with multiple people. So that was the focus group. The quantitative research was much more about trying to we looked at a few things. We did an ACE survey to look at the history of trauma. We did an attachment survey to try and find out was there more attachment avoidance versus attachment anxiety. And then we used the HBI to assess their hypersexual behavior inventory, to assess their level of out of control sexual behavior. And what came out of that research that was so important was that we really noted that avoidantly attached men really, there was this higher correlation between avoidance and hypersexual behavior, or out of control sexual behavior, or for those of you that call it sex addiction or sexual compulsivity. And we saw the correlation. I thought that there'd be a correlation to just insecure attached men, both avoidant and anxious. But what showed up was that most of them were avoidant. And with avoidant attachment styles, what we see oftentimes is we see a fearful quality or a dismissive quality. So I've had many patients that have come in to treatment, and their first bit of business with me is to dismiss me, to question me, to kind of push me away. And it's my job to find creative ways to pull them back in, but also to address the dismissiveness. Because if we don't help them understand that, if we don't collaborate with them, then we're not going to go anywhere. This slide says avoidantly attached men act unreactive, so they are deactivated. Although, again, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? You got all this other stuff going on underneath. But one of the really interesting studies that they did after they started to really look at attachment theories, you know, the early studies were the strange situation studies, right? That Ainsworth did, and looking at what happens to kids when their mothers are taken out of the room that they were playing in, maybe with other kids in some cases, and so on. And what happens when they then bring the mother back in. And so they would oftentimes see like what they discovered was that avoidantly attached kids, which become the avoidantly attached men that we work with, would act like they didn't care. They would act like it doesn't matter. You know, whatever, take her out, bring her back in, doesn't really matter. You know, 50-50 on this. But what was interesting is they took the studies further and they said, why don't we actually put a heart monitor on the kids that are, you know, presenting as deactivated and avoidant, and their hearts gave them away. So their heart rate was increased. Clearly there was some distress, but there was no expression of it. I tell my male patients this research, because I tell them that their hearts will give them away. And that's part of the job, is for me to get them to let their hearts give them away, to get to what's under the tip of the iceberg, so that we really can make a change. Like, it's not too late. It's not too late. It's not like, oh, they are a victim of a socialization process and now that's over. So I give a strong message about that early in treatment. Let's talk real quickly about attachment theory and how attachment theory and affect theory go hand in hand. And some of you may be familiar with the article by John Bowlby, 44 Thieves, where John Bowlby started to notice that 44 of the children that were in a residential care setting where they were getting their needs met were choosing thievery. They were stealing food and they didn't need it. They were stealing whatever they were stealing. They were stealing clothes. They were stealing things, whether or not they needed it. So that became really interesting to Bowlby. He's like, why? Why do we have this subgroup of kids that do this, and what does it mean? And so in looking what he decided to do, and it was like, he even used statistics and case reviews, he dove into the files and the case studies of these kids that were stealing, the 44 thieves. And what we see is that and I'm gonna kind of connect it with sexual behavior, is that oftentimes these kids had a history of deprivation, emotional neglect, attachment trauma. And what's most important about that is that that type of trauma created loneliness. Let's go back to loneliness, anger, which then if you're shut down and you don't have access to emotions that could be used relationally, then you start to get hungry and you start to get greedy. And so I actually use these terms, and it might be a little jarring to the audience, but I use these terms because I want to detoxify the conversation about this. And so I say to my patients, and I say it to them in group or individual, I have a lot of people in combined treatment, is that their sexual behavior is eroticized hunger, and it's eroticized greed, and that it creates an illusory solution that's based in quantity. More pornography, more sexual imagery, more sexual partners, more commercial sex. Eroticized hunger and greed. And so again, finding the solution in quantity, and it works until it doesn't. And then the patient tries again, and then again. And this is really when they start to move to a place of recognizing that there's something going on here. And either they recognize it and they get treatment, or their spouse recognizes it or discovers it and they get treatment, or they enter into recovery, or whatever it is that they might do. But this type of solution is an illusion. And Bowlby often said that people's attachment traumas, their struggles, lead them to a solution that eventually becomes the problem. And once it becomes the problem, that's when there's the chance of treatment. So let's talk about men's emotionality. What we have seen, and I've kind of pieced this together, and I've talked to my patients about this, and I think it's a really helpful way to communicate to patients, is that because of the socialization process, because of emphatic separations, because of changes in friendships, and these are all things that you can get from a attachment narrative, asking the right questions about their upbringing, trying to dig deep, and addressing their dismissiveness about such questions. But what we recognize is that our men have a difficulty putting their feelings into words. Like, that's where the emotional literacy piece comes in. Is like, if I'm feeling something, can I consciously name it? Okay, so this is, if you recall, the concept of alexithymia is the inability to label your feeling states, name it, and then use it. But unfortunately for our men, because because of the tip of the iceberg model, and because of the mutedness and the deactivations, the feelings are experienced in their body, bodily tension. And then bodily attention is addressed through bodily action. This is a very important piece. If you help men understand the autoregulatory aspect of their behaviors and tell them why that's there, it's de-shaming, and they can understand it from a more expansive point of view. So the bodily tension is addressed through bodily action. That's true for people with eating disorders. That's true for people with out of control sexual behavior. That's true for people with manic defenses, is that the next thing you know, they're out doing something. How many of our patients have told us that they were thinking they were doing fine until something happened, and next thing you know, they are engaging in out of control behaviors? And most importantly, or second most importantly, is that these feelings that they have, that they don't recognize, that they don't label, that they experience in their body, that they turn into bodily action, are not used relationally. And so the treatment in so many ways is about getting them to use it relationally. How do you move them towards relationality, or co-regulation, as I like to call it? And so I'll always point out when I hear my men operating in a place of auto-regulation, or operating in a place of what I like to call toxic self-sufficiency. I think it was it Lavon? It was one of the writers that called it defensive autonomy. I like to call it toxic self-sufficiency. Men are toxically self-sufficient. So something to use and think about when you're working with your men. So let's take a couple of questions, if there are any questions, and then I'll get into a shorter presentation on treatment. Any questions from the group?
Do you want to go into your Q&A? There are,
Yeah. Oh, is my Q&A? I guess I could. I don't see, oops, sorry. Okay, I got it. Got the, wait, got it. Okay. Okay, the first question that came out was about Lavon's research, and I'm really happy to send the bibliography for this presentation to everyone. stated that addiction is a problem of connection. He has been criticized for ignoring the research on the roots. Yet your work at attachment seems to expand on the premise by looking at social development issues. Should I read that out loud again? I just realized I was just reading to myself. Joanne Harry in his TED Talk stated that addiction is a problem of connection. He has been criticized for ignoring the research on the roots of addiction. Yet your work on attachment seems to expand on his premise by looking at social developmental issues. And I completely agree. And I feel like in doing so, I mean, it really is I'm trained as a licensed social worker, and I got my doctorate in social work. And so I think about things ecologically. And so I really do see, in response to Stephen Devlin, I really do see that we must understand, think of it in concentric circles. We have to understand the outer circle of social, then the circle of culture, then the circle of family, then the circle of intrapsychic work. And so it is a combination of looking at things from a societal perspective, but then deeply diving into the issue of affect and how affect can be used in these ways that are compulsive and addictive. And, like a great deal of the use of out of control sexual behavior and other types of addiction is like, I'm going to ward off a negative feeling that I'm not even aware of. And then if you add on, once it starts taking on a life of its own, it could have this addictive energy, which is where I just have to keep doing it. I have to keep doing it. I have to keep doing it. It goes back to Bowlby's concept of eroticized greed. And that's why I use that language with my patients, so that they start to really understand what the roots are. So that's a great question, Stephen. Thank you. This is from John Johnson. When you talked about anger and the iceberg metaphor, would this explain teenage angst that many boys display? Yes, very much yes, very much yes. And in the book that I had mentioned, where Deep Secrets, you would hear a lot about that. Like the Deep Secrets are really about the idea that no longer can they express that angst I'll say in a psycholinguistic way, like being able to actually put it to words in order to then have it dealt with relationally. And so there's no question that, and it's heartbreaking to me, I will say, because there's so much more suicidality and homicidality in the boys that we work with and the men that they become. So it feels really important for us to look, and it goes back to why the ecological model is so important. It feels really important that we address this from multiple vantage points of socially and family intervention and intrapsychic intervention. So I feel really strongly about this because I also, like I said, it's breaking my heart. Okay, Barbara Winter. Hi, Barbara. And Barbara's saying, hi, Michael. A bit off topic, but with men, there are often diagnoses of NPD and or Asperger's. Often there are similarities with things like theory of mind. Do you work with them any different? Probably a question for another workshop. Well, it's a little bit of a question for another workshop, but I will say that it's a great question. And I'll comment on it. Because of where I came from, I started in my work with people with men with developmental disabilities. My very first entree into dealing with out of control sexual behavior was I was running a group of men that were high functioning, developmentally disabled. Some of them had Asperger's, some of them a little bit more on the severe level of Asperger's. And it still exists, I'm happy to say, and I did this 25 years ago. It's called Project Respect. And the way that I worked with them, and I'm also more than happy, Barbara, to send you, I actually put together an article on the work that I did for this group of men, and also even put together a little bit of a protocol for how to address sexuality issues with people with developmental disabilities or people that have Asperger's. Is that I did a lot of psychoeducation. Psychoeducation was essential. And so I'll be happy to send that information to anyone that's interested. In terms of narcissistic personality disorder, you know, I have not, well, maybe I take this back. Maybe I had one or two people that were NPD that I lost in treatment for the reasons that relate to their diagnoses, and also maybe reasons related to my ability to be effective with people that were really on that range. But I will say that the majority of my patients come in with a degree of narcissism that I am effective in addressing. But there have been a few guys that were just couldn't tolerate the confrontation that I feel is somewhat necessary. I feel like building an alliance is necessary, but then the addressing the dismissiveness and the devaluing becomes very important. And that, I think it would be a great topic for a workshop on working with people with narcissism and so on, because we have a lot of that. And I think that relates to Superego Lacunae as well. Thanks, Barbara. Okay, we have, this one's anonymous. Thank you. This is so interesting. I'm wondering if these ideas would also apply to a fetish. I'm thinking of a young client with a food gaining fetish that began as a young boy, eroticizing, gaining weight, and overeating. Thank you. Yes. In fact, what I did is I kind of, I took some of the slides out because I knew that we would run out of time, but I do a whole thing on the difference between someone that has a paraphilic out of control sexual behavior versus people that have a non-paraphilic out of control sexual behavior. And so I have a guy that has a very severe paraphilic out of control sexual behavior, which relates to a leg fetish and a foot fetish, and there's filming involved. He writes a script, he directs it, he's in the script, in the play, whatever you want to call it, and he films it, then he watches it, masturbates to it, and then he destroys it, and then he does it again. And so to this question is, I have been working with this particular patient, and I'm still working with him in this exact way, is that addressing what's under the iceberg, addressing, getting to the places, and this is where we'll talk about this more in treatment, is getting to the places where you really get them to start recognizing the sadness, really, and the ruptures that they experienced in their lives. So much of the treatment is really, really focusing in on that, not letting them get away with minimizing it, but really getting into what this is all about. And how does this relate to the out of control behaviors? And we've done a lot of great work. And I will say, I think it was Goodman that said, you want to evaluate these out of control behaviors based on intensity, duration, and frequency. And all three of those areas have dropped and dissipated for him. So it's a very interesting topic to talk about. I think we could probably do an entire workshop on what does it mean to work with people with paraphilic out of control behaviors. So thanks for the question. And this is from Peggy Albano. Can you expand and or repeat what you said about attachment wounds leading to illusory solutions that then become the problem? I believe this was something from Bowlby. Yes. One of the slides that I usually use, and I didn't use it this time in order to kind of limit the amount of slides I was going through, is that, so Bowlby said that that when we had these attachment wounds, when we had this deprivation, when we had these ruptures, and when we experienced emotional neglect, that human beings are very, very adaptive. And what he felt was that in attachment theory, that insecure, anxious, insecure, avoidant were ways of trying to solve the problem that they were having. And usually, as I mentioned, for people with out of control sexual behavior, in quantity, not quality, quantity. Give me more, more, more. It goes back to the 44 Thieves. And so there's a slide I usually use that says attachment problem, okay? And then it's a cycle, and then it goes into solution. Okay, I'm just gonna get more, get more, get more, get more. And then it goes into problem, which means like, oh, this is causing me difficulties. I'm getting myself in trouble, or I'm spending too much money, and so on. And then it goes back to, we must address the attachment difficulty. And so I'll get into this when we get into treatment. There are ways to translate people's behaviors so that they understand what the attachment difficulty is. So, okay. Stephen Devlin, at what age stage would you say that the attachment can move from grief, loss to crisis? Middle childhood, teenage? I would say middle childhood. I see that in all the theories of Lavon and Pollock and Pleck and Way. They are noticing what they're noticing, which I think is really fascinating, is that they're noticing it in phases of you have it happens in early childhood, where the child starts to then get deactivated and in a sense is dealing with certain still-faced experiences. That's the way I like to put it. And then it happens again in their friendships, according to Way, which is, again, great book, Deep Secrets. And then we see it just, it's almost like it snowballs. It snowballs, which lands us with the iceberg. So I see it in multiple phases.
Michael?
Yeah.
So there is a remark from Diane. In your reference, will you have the name of the picture of the wire adults that you showed from Birmingham?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, and then there's another remark. The project Respect, fabulous. Would love to hear more about it.
Okay, great.
Youth and adults with disabilities are dismissed as being sexual in
Being sexual in what? I think we lost your audio.
Yep, I think we lost Renee. This is Mary, so I'll read. It says, would love to know more on this. Youth and adults with disabilities are dismissed as being sexual in much the same way as boys are dismissed as being emotional, is what.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, what I'd like to also offer in this bibliography is the materials that I came up with for Project Respect, because and they're a little dated, so just keep that in mind. I did it in the 90s, but they're not dated in terms of utility. They're really quite wonderful in terms of the outline of the Project Respect, how we approached it, what types of areas of psychoeducation did we focus on, and that Project Respect was all about moving them towards healthy sexuality, not move you, because it's so true that people with developmental disabilities, there is a quickness to I guess either wish them to not be sexual, want them to not be sexual, and people with developmental disabilities have sexuality just like all of us do. And so I'd be happy to put that on the reference list. Okay.
Okay,
so
let's continue. Yep.
Yeah, sounds good. Sorry, I just had to do some creative things with the PowerPoint. So here's a few things that I want people to keep in mind in how we're looking at treatment. is one of the ways that I work with treatment is that I translate affects that are behavioralized. So if you go back to that slide where I said that men don't experience their feelings in a conscious way, they can't label it. They have like what Lavon called normative male alexithymia. And he was saying that men were in a sense socialized to not know what they feel. And so what that means is that we must become behavioral analysts. But in our behavioral analysis, we have to be thinking, how does this translate to an affect? And then you have to do some digging. You have to go under. You have to wonder, like, where are those feeling states? And then you have to do a sales pitch. Because in doing this translation of behaviors into affects, we're also letting them know that there's a reason why we believe they should have their affects. And I say, without knowing their affects or their feelings, they are left without their affective GPS. They're aimless. Feeling states are signals. Feeling states tell us what we need. If we can really flesh it out, we can really discover that we have blended feeling states, and we can find out what all the needs are that are associated with them. Anger can be related to the idea of a boundary or saying no or protecting oneself. Sadness could be about, I need to pull someone in, I need comfort. But if we don't know that, if we don't know what fear is indicating or sadness is indicating or anger is indicating, then we are aimless. We are aimless, and the chances are that the person will be having that feeling state, not knowing that they're having that feeling state, and end up somewhere, end up doing something that they later regret. And that is a big part of the work that we do. The beginning part of treatment, in both, and I'll talk about combined treatment, but in both individual and group, I am a behavior translator into affects. That is the work I do. And it's gotten very, very focused that way, which has allowed for a lot more success. So treatment is about discovering our affective GPS. Affects and feelings help us understand our needs. It requires courage to feel the vulnerability of need and desire. So one of the ways that I do this is through and I highly recommend this if people are able to do it. If you're, even in this day and age where we're doing so many things virtually, it is so, so important to do, in my opinion, to do combined treatment, because there's so much more to work with. So to have someone that's an individual and I'm trying to translate his behaviors into affects is great, but to have them in a group where other group members might have made more progress in their affective GPS, where they can say to someone, it sounds like there's more going on underneath there. The best interpretations, the best interventions come from the group members, not me. I don't run a group where I'm the center of the group. I run a group where I occasionally jump in, but I foster this cohesion in the group where other people are sharing what they're experiencing with other people. And if it needs some help, I will jump in. But the combined treatment model is the model of choice, I believe, in working with this, and putting these guys into a group is essential. And timing is also important. You also, like, I don't put people in group right away. I do some work with them. I develop an alliance. I get a better sense of their attachment narrative. I get a sense of where they're coming from. I get a sense of whether or not they're avoidant or they're anxious or they're dismissive or fearful. I really work on that. And one thing I want to say, because I'm not sure I was that clear about this, is that to go back to the idea of the combined treatment and to go back to the idea of the avoidant attachment style and how their hearts would give them away. Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main were very clear that in all the insecure attachment styles, underneath those attachment styles was fear. So it's really important for us to know that with our avoidant men, it's not like they don't have anxiety. It's just that they've defended against it. They've become very good at defending against it. That's part of the solution for them. That becomes the problem. So it's very, very important that people understand that. Like because for one of the reasons that has to do with treatment is that as our avoidant men get better, they first get anxious. They first start getting overwhelmed by their feelings. And we have to be what they would call the self-object that's in the room that's going to help them to contain what's happening and help them to recognize how much of it is historical. You know, when they say it's hysterical, it's historical. You know, what level of, what is this hearkening back to? So that's a very important piece of understanding the avoidant attachment style and why we do combined treatment. So the other piece of this has to do with self-compassion. I was at the SASH conference in Austin, and I am going to forget her name. Kristen, I forget her last name, did the keynote talk on self-compassion. And so when she wrote a book on it, she did her dissertation work on it. So when I went to the talk, the part of me that sometimes has my own deactivation and my own dissociation was like, oh, I guess this will be interesting. We'll hear about self-compassion. That would be nice. But that's not what I heard. It was science. And she did such a great job, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting her name, but I do think her first name was Kristen. And I did buy her book, is that...
Kristen Neff.
Neff. Okay, great. Thank you. Kristen Neff. Okay. I will tell you that I was blown away by her talk, and then I bought her book and read it because she correlated increases in self-compassion with decreases in risk of variety of addictive behavior, sexual behavior, eating issues, shopping issues. It's like if we don't help our men and our clients in general to increase their self-compassion, we're not going to go anywhere. And if you bring this back to the beginning of my presentation, I would also say it's like, this is the superego work. The superego, there's a part of it, and Freud said this, is the part of the superego that's actually caring. And that we can have like an idealized sense of who we should be and how we should be with others. And self-compassion is the root to that. So if you look at self-compassion, recognize that we can use mindfulness, self-kindness, and connectedness to really increase our self-compassion, then we will be doing better work. Like I tell my patients about the Kristen Neff experience, because I was going in there kind of like, oh, I don't know, we're probably just going to meditate or something like that. And yet she comes out with all this hard science and this incredible book that she put together and some wonderful metaphors of understanding self-compassion. And I walked out of there and I said, I've got to let my patients know how important this is. And so every time I hear them attack themselves, I'm going to go after it and see if I can change it around. So the other thing is that one of the things that we really, really need to do is we need to support friendships in addition to primary relationships. Harry Stack Sullivan, who wrote about interpersonal psychotherapy, or was really the founder of it in many ways, he would talk about the need for the chum relationship. Having a buddy that you can feel like you're connected to, that allows you some psychic space from other relationships, that allows you to feel like you have a confidant, feel like you have someone that you can trust. And that I've started, since I've like done more of the research around this work, I've started to ask my patients about their friendships. not just what's happening at home, not just a report on where they're at with their behaviors and whatnot, but well, what are their friendships like? What were their friendships like? Did they have a best friend? Do they continue to have a best friend? If not, when did it change? A lot of this parallels all the researchers that I'm mentioning, Pollack, Lavon, and Pleck. So I strongly urge you to check in with your patients about that. Find out more about their, in a sense, their friendship trajectory, so that you can understand more about what's happening now. And if you're hearing that there's a deficit, that they don't have these friendships, start to wonder with them what to do about that. And what, or better yet, let's go back a minute, what the price is not having that. What should we do about it? So one of the things that I strongly want to emphasize is that affect expression. So we do this behavioral translation. We start getting people more tuned into what's underneath the tip of the iceberg. And what I have found in doing longer term treatment and doing combined treatment is that the affect expression will activate grief, and I'm talking about real grief, regret, and new beginnings. And that in our work, we normalize that and celebrate it. So one thing I want to share that's not on the slide, but I think it's a fascinating phenomenon, is that when you'll know when a patient is truly in a place of experiencing grief and regret, and that grief and regret could be about their primary relationship, and it could be about their history. It could be about their life. It could be about their relationship with their fathers, their relationship with their mothers, their relationship with their brothers and sisters. You'll know it because you'll see it, and it will feel different. Many of you will have had the experience of having a patient that's crying in front of you and you're not moved by the tears. That's when you know they're not there yet. They're not there yet. I worked with a couple that, I'm going to use a prop here. I worked with a couple, so I have the Kleenex here, and I worked with a couple where the husband, in showing his regret and showing his concern for his wife, was to just grab a tissue every time she cried and hand it to her. And I finally confronted him and said, you think that somehow, I confronted him, I said, you think somehow that's you showing that you care, and I'm not buying it. Like, I'm not moved at that moment. And so I'm wondering about why I'm not moved. Or if someone's tearful and I'm not moved by the tears, I will wonder where those tears are coming from and what's really happening. And then when you have the experience of a patient that really is now getting underneath the tip of the iceberg, getting to those feeling states, you'll see that they are actually experiencing grief and regret. And one of the ways that you know that, this has been very much a new awareness that I've had in the last 7 years. And it came out of a lot of discussion with colleagues. And then we even did a workshop on it, is that when people start to move away from these quantity solutions, these illusory solutions, their relationship to time changes. That's how you know you're entering into this grief and regret part. They start to notice that they're getting older. They start to notice that their children are getting older. They start to know, like I had one patient that said, I just can't believe I feel like time is flying now. When he first came in, he didn't know what time was. You know, these are the types of patients, when they first come into treatment, they're usually a few minutes late because they're harried. And this is just another appointment. And then they got to get back to the office. And then they got to keep moving, keep moving. So in psychoanalytic thinking, that's a manic defense, and it's a defense against time and grief and regret. So you will know if your patient is truly in grief and regret, they're going to start talking about time wasted, time passing, the time that they want to honor and respect that they're living now. That's the exciting part. I celebrate that. I think I told you I had one patient that came in, was just talking about his kids getting older. And I was like, well, I think they've been getting older all along. It's just interesting that you're really noticing it now. And we were able to really flesh it out. And I was able to say, you know, this is how I know you're moving in the right direction. I said, you have entered into the truth of regret and grief, not some false self-presentation of it.
Michael, mentioning time, we have 5 minutes left.
Okay, good. I'm almost there. So we must teach men to experience their vulnerability, and we must move away from here, madmen, move to this, vulnerability, and this, grief. We must grieve, and we must grieve in a real way in order to experience this, relationality, co-regulation, or this, relationality, co-regulation, and I even threw a polyamorous relationship in there for you. Going along with the mission of Society of the Advancement of Sexual Health is like being quite open-minded and looking at all different types of expressions. So we're entertaining all of these types of relational configurations. And so this is where we want to arrive. And we also want to turn to this. We want to help our men become the boys that the pre-rupture, pre-emphatic separation, where they actually had joyous and exciting relationships with their friends, and to really recognize, like, we get a little myopic in the work we do because we're so focused on the addiction and the couple and the work with the couple, that the partner that discovered and disclosure. I also am asking people to take into account friendships, take into account that our men have lost so much. There's so much loss in it. And that when you really work with someone and they're getting there, it will break your heart. And that's when you know you're doing good work.